Hi, this is Dina for Splitcoaststampers. In this tutorial, I wanted to expand on an older site tutorial called Misting with Markers because stamp positioners allow us to do a little more with that technique. I've got my watercolor paper secured in place, and I'm going to start by just stamping an image to refer to. Then I'll begin with my first color. The original tutorial was done with a wood block stamp, so we applied all of our colors with a marker, misted the stamp with water, and then we kind of had one shot for stamping the image. So the stamp positioner allows us to work one color at a time or in sections of the image. So I've colored the stems and leaves green using the side of my marker, and then a light misting with water will activate the ink and give me a little time before it dries. You can experiment with the amount of water for different effects too. Less water will produce more detail, and more water will give more of a loose watercolor effect. Here you can leave the stamped outline alone, or you can use a wet brush like I'm doing here to blend the color into the open areas, and that is completely up to you. Moving on to my petal color here, I'm using the side of my marker again to color the outlines of the flowers. I got a little ink on the leaf here, so I used a paper towel to remove that. You can use a baby wipe as well. And then I will mist the stamp again and stamp it to my paper. Again, I'm just pulling color into the open area of the flower with a wet brush. And I had left the flower centers uncolored. I wanted to use orange on those, so I'm avoiding that area of the image a little bit. I missed a couple of areas in my outline, and I also wanted my outlines a little bit darker. So I repeated some of my pink inking and also added a third color in the flower centers, that orange there. As I'm blending a little more, you'll see that I've lost that separation between the two bottom flowers. So I just inked that line alone and stamped again. As the water dries on the card, as the ink dries, you'll have a little more control of the details of your image, so you can continue stamping and layering until you have the effect that you want. You can see some of the green ink bleeding into the pink here too. To control that bleed a little bit more, you can let your panel dry in between applications of color. I did pull out my heat tool here to stop the ink from bleeding and to dry my panel. And now I can go back in and ink just specific areas of the stamp without misting to add some sharper details. Here I decided I wanted a little orange on the buds inside the lines and not on the outline. And I also wanted to create a little bit of contrast and warmth in the green areas. So I scribbled a little bit of orange ink onto my stamp positioner for some palette blending. So I can just pick that up with my wet brush and apply it to my stamped image. So here's that sample. For another look, I'm going to add all my colors to the stamp as I did before. So pink petals, orange centers, and green leaves and stem. And now instead of misting the stamp, I'm going to mist the paper. And you want a light mist here, just enough to activate the ink. And if it doesn't bleed out as much as you want it to, you can mist lightly again, just directly onto the stamped image on the paper to move the ink further. You'll want to let that ink air dry. Keep your stamp in place on the other side of the stamp positioner. And then when your paper panel is dry, you can stamp the image again without misting. And the first impression will create a sort of impressionistic coloring in of the image. Here's another option with this same technique. I stamped the inked image into water, and then instead of a light misting, I went pretty heavy with the misting and let the color really flow around the panel. Instead of leaving the outline image after I stamped it, I used the same markers to color in the image, and I blended with a wet brush. And I'll probably go back in and add some highlights with a paint pen after that dries. This is just a freebie technique for you, and this is just fun to do for a grungy or splattery kind of background. You're going to color up your stamp however you want to. I've got that same combination of 3 different markers here. Mist it generously with water, and then kind of slap or smack your positioner closed. And all that extra watery ink will splatter out around the image. I don't know, that one's just fun sometimes, so I thought I'd throw it in. One more card, and for this one I used a more complex image, so this isn't included in the photo tutorial. I just thought it would be easier to walk through here. This is a Stampscapes image, and it's pretty detailed, but it does have some definite color blocks. I started with a brown marker, and I used that to color the trunks of the trees and the larger branches kind of here and there, and then the shape of the roof. With images like this, you do need a little bit of planning ahead because you can work in layers. Your initial layers will be a little bit lighter and more wet and loose. And as you build up, you can darken and concentrate colors and use a little less water or no water at all to stamp more detail onto your panel. Again, it's really helpful to have a reference image for these detailed images too. Just hard to find things in there when there's so many details and everything's backwards. This is a stamp that I unmounted from the wood block, so I had that for reference while I was working. Something to note is that each time you mist the stamp, you're adding water to areas of the stamp that aren't colored, and also potentially adding more water to areas that you've already stamped and may have already started to dry. So you can use a paper towel to cover up areas of the stamp when you mist water, or you can use a paper towel to blot water either from the stamp or the paper to control your moisture a little bit more. You can also use a heat gun to dry the paper so you're not putting wet ink into more wet ink. For the trees, I just added color in spots, and then I did the same with a lighter color in a second layer to create a little bit more depth. That back corner of the house gave me a little trouble since red, green, and brown were converging right there. Kind of created a little muddy spot in that little section. So you'll see me use the paper towel several times to dry the stamp and also blot water from the card right there. I used the brush to blend out the roof a little bit, and then I left the panel to dry for a while. I just let it air dry until it was visibly dry, and then I used the heat gun to really dry it well before I moved on. Next, I used a finer marker to color in the windows and the door. In this new layer, I'm adding more details and less water as I layer over the base layers of color. There are some cast shadows on the image that I wanted to add in too. And then I just lightly blended those out with a tiny brush. And here you can see I'm just using a dotting motion so I don't lose any of my stamped lines. Here's another cast shadow under the porch. In the shrubs, I dotted some darker ink toward the bottom and used the brush to blend the ink on the stamp before pressing it down. So that's an alternative to misting with water. That gives you a little bit more control of your coloring. I'm using that darker green in the trees again, just dotting toward the bottoms of the branches to create some shadows, and I'm not adding water this time. I wanted just the tops of the trees to blend out a little bit, so I used my paper towel to cover the rest of the image, and you can see how the misted water allows those branches to extend. So that's a quick tour of how this card was created. I hope that walkthrough helps you see my process a little bit better. I covered a lot here, but the best way to learn and understand this technique is really just to do it. Remember, you'll have different results depending on the amount of water you use and how and where you apply it. Take time to experiment, don't be afraid to mess up, and just have fun figuring out what works best for you. Thank you so much for watching.